Well, ladies and gentlemen, I must say you must be rather disappointed when I got up onto the podium, having heard that introduction. Merely point out that the previous speaker had been Prime Minister in his own country, which I think probably rates substantially higher up the ladder of achievement. Very nice to be here in Berlin, and nice to be speaking to your organization, which is the second time now I've done it. And when I started thinking about my remarks this afternoon, I realized that the world was a very unstable place. But of course, it's got a lot more unstable since then. At the beginning of the year, we know that the Middle East, from roughly the Middle East to Central Asia, there's complete turmoil. But now that uncertainty, if it is that uncertainty, not something different, has spread into Europe with Brexit in my country, the referendum in Italy, a referendum in Holland that was lost, and now the election of Donald Trump in the United States. So the character of the moment where we are now is one, I think, of instability. And of course, instability is a threat to human rights. And it's in the context of that I'd like to think about it and try and share a few thoughts with you in the forthcoming minutes. But when we talk about human rights, I think we want to be clear about what we're talking about, because it's a kind of omnibus phrase that covers a number of different things, in my view. First of all, there are what I would describe as basic fundamental human rights, which I happen to believe in. Not everybody in the world does. And I believe they come with the human, as an individual, I believe they come with the human condition to an individual. But I think they're different from economic and social rights, a number of which, for example, are contained in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. I think there's something slightly different from that. And I also think we want to be on our guard against what I might call pseudo-rights, because there are unscrupulous politicians in the world who argue things for their own political advantage to try and inflame people either in their own or other countries. And those, I think, we need to be on our guard against, because if you bracket them with human rights, I think you end up eroding the fundamental concept. But what is the instability in the world? Are we, as somebody has argued, at a point in global history where perhaps we're going to see a kind of shift in the tectonic plates that may last for maybe even hundreds of years, not merely decades? Or are we at a time where it's much less significant, if I can put it that way? I mean, clearly globalization is something which is affecting all parts of the world. And that has political, economic, and I think legal significance, which is important. Because the events in my country recently, in the United States, suggest that perhaps technology is behind a lot of what is changing the world in different ways. I didn't think that. If I'd been giving this speech 2 or 3 months ago, I probably wouldn't have said that. But there is a strong argument, I think, that while technology over time creates jobs, we may be at a point in history where actually it's destroying more than it's creating. And that is causing uncertainty. That's, of course, true, but different from what's going on in the Middle East, which is the area I describe roughly from Syria to Afghanistan, where there is just simply political upheaval. And we're seeing there, of course, something which is, on one level, like a return to the end of the Ottoman Empire, where you have nominal states, but in practice, sub-state actors are dominating a great deal of life on the ground. They are providing the security and the framework for life, often in small geographical areas, which previously a state used to provide. And one of, I think, the interesting and important things that's going on is that we're seeing in some parts of the globe, the destruction of for want of a better way of putting it, the Westphalian settlement, and a return to something that's gone perhaps before. I mean, I've heard the problems in the Middle East described as being more akin to the 30 Years' War than anything else. And quite honestly, I don't believe anybody in this room can tell me either how or when the current conflicts are going to end. Now, I'm on the House of Lords Committee on International Relations, and we had a round table in Parliament 3 weeks ago where we asked a number of students from the Middle East area studying in and around London to talk to us off the record about their views about my country, Britain, and the state of the world. And one of the things which slightly shocked me, although perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, was their concern was increasingly for security rather than democracy. If you are frightened about your own family's physical well-being, if you aren't sure how much food there is going to be on the table, then you will seriously tell yourself, well, perhaps we'd better curtail a bit of liberty to try and secure the other. It's human nature. And the other thing which runs in parallel with this, I believe, is that where things go wrong, people look for scapegoats. Just as when we make mistakes in our own lives, we try and justify it. Where things go wrong in society, groups of people try and find others to whom they can pin the blame. And of course, one of the greatest threats, in my view, to human rights is fundamentalism. And it's interesting, if you look through history, there is something in the collective human gene which finds it attractive, whether it was iconoclasm in Byzantium, or the Reformation across much of Northern Europe, or the French Revolution and the Terror and Robespierre, Hitler and Stalin, or the Cultural Revolution in China and Pol Pot. There is something, unfortunately, in our collective makeup which finds fundamentalism and intolerance attractive. And that is very frightening. And I think that the key to trying to dampen that down is that the framework round life has got to be one of the rule of law, democracy, and freedom. And if you can achieve that and a degree of prosperity so that people don't feel tempted by the overwhelming requirements to put food on the table, then I think you're going to have an environment where human rights will best be respected. And you've got to have this both within any jurisdiction, and there are different legal ways of putting human rights on the statute book. You can either have them simply as ordinary laws, which are vulnerable to takeover and change, or you can, as it happens in some jurisdictions, you can entrench them. But also you need to try and have a system which is wider than a simple nation state, some international framework to deal with these things, to provide the context. And that, of course, is something like the European Convention across Europe, or the UN Convention. They're different, but they fulfill, to some extent, a similar sort of role and have behind them a similar aspiration. And then, of course, if you're going to have human rights, you've got to have a system that can enforce them. And it's no good having the most marvelous statements of high intention if they're abused and ignored wherever you turn. And again, the same thing applies. You need to have national systems, you need to have international systems, and you need to have courts that will actually enforce them. And you need to have a legal system that, where required, will actually find against the government of a country. Now, regardless of the rights and wrongs of the recent decision in my country to leave the European Union, I think it is very much to our country's credit that the High Court told the government it was completely wrong about the way in which it was setting about it. And that matters. On the other side, I've mentioned I was chairman of a manufacturing company in England, and we planned to open a factory in China. Arguably, the main reason why we did not do so was because we could not guarantee in our own minds the security of the contractual arrangements on which we were going to do it. A law which is fair and free and can't be bought, either by political pressure or by gold, is obviously enormously important. And of course, if this all breaks down, as we see, you get oppression, loss of freedom, poor economy, which then simply promotes the desire for authoritarianism, and the general challenge to liberal democracy, which leads to anarchy, which leads to oppression, which leads to injustice, which leads to a whole range of things contrary to the values we collectively believe in. And of course, then there's a matter of leadership. I always say that in democratic countries, political leaders lead, and in authoritarian countries, they follow, which is sometimes a reversal of the generally accepted norm. But dictators latch onto the people's fears and exploit them. And that is something which leads to trouble. And all this goes back to what's been touched on earlier, which is cultural values. And it's in a widest sense, it's culture which defines this, which why culture, using that word in its widest sense, in my view, is so important. And in terms of human rights, the kind of the succession goes back to the Enlightenment and then back to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and it's about the importance of the individual in society. It's different from a number of the traditions, particularly in the East, but also, I think, one which Karl Marx would have subscribed to, which is when push comes to shove, it's the collective that is the thing that matters most. And I believe we've got to keep that in our minds all the time. And the other side of this educational coin, if I can put it that way, is, in my view, intellectual curiosity. If, and I believe it's a function of education that it engenders that, you are curious about other things and other people, you're going a long way down the road to being tolerant and trying to understand and trying to accept. Now, how do you promote all this? And the one thing I'm absolutely sure about is you can't force it. It may be possible to shame people to improve their human rights record, but it's effectively impossible to force them to do it. And I was, for a number of years, the vice president of the European Parliament's China delegation. And one of the instructions that we had was to raise human rights issues with the Chinese regime. And it was very interesting. Over the 5-year period when I was involved, we used to raise the question of human rights. And at the beginning, the tough lady who was leader of the Chinese delegation looked very severe. She then opened a huge handbag that she had next to her, pulled out a prepared statement, and gave us a lecture for between 20 minutes and half an hour on the wonders of what Chinese were doing, and it was impertinent to be lectured at. By the end of that 5-year period, when we started raising the topic of human rights, their eyes just glazed over, because they had grown in self-confidence sufficiently that they didn't care anymore whether we thought they were abusing human rights or not. And that is, in fact, a very sinister position to find yourself in, because if people don't care, your ability to exercise leverage is, I think, substantially reduced. I think you can do these things by exposure. I mean, one of the interesting things which I learned when I was in the European Parliament in the early 90s, that one of the real reasons why the old East German regime collapsed was that video camera record of the riots in Leipzig was smuggled back into the West and then was transmitted through television back into East Germany. And once people in East Germany realized that their leaders were telling them complete lies, the moral authority of the regime simply dissolved. And if you can do that and expose abuses in that way, I think it is possible to shame people into changing. And of course, the interesting thing about that is, and I speak as somebody who's been involved in newspapers, the freedom of the press is terribly important, because while the press can on occasions behave abominably, nevertheless, in authoritarian and aspirant authoritarian regimes, they are the medium, and it's changing in the world of social media, but it's still the press, using that word in a generic sense. That is the means of getting the message out and telling the truth. And the kind of things that bring about human rights abuses do not like and shy away from the truth. Equally, when thinking about human rights, I don't think we could completely overlook perhaps the obligations that go with it. There's a tendency, which I think is a pity, for people to think of human rights as being distinct in the sense that they're completely freestanding. I think with human rights goes certain responsibilities and obligations, which leads on to something I'm going to say in a moment about one's behavior, oneself. Because if you're not careful, in the simple terms, if you don't have a rule of law, a framework, people who are strong end up bullying people who are weak. And I don't like that. And of course, this is where soft power, which the President was talking about, comes in. In Britain, I think we both are in a strong position in respect of soft power, and also have probably been quite a good exponent of it. And recently, my House of Parliament, the House of Lords, wrote a very interesting report about soft power in the context of the UK. But the greatest exponent of soft power, probably before the term was even invented, was the United States, because they had something called Hollywood. And Hollywood is the best example of the effectiveness of soft power, and it wasn't even intended to be. So these things can work in a very interesting way. And equally, things like Erasmus program. I mean, probably quite a number of people in this room have been involved in the Erasmus program. But it is a wonderful means for the recipient country, the country to which the students go, to build up links so that the apparent caricatures of each other are no longer believed. And that is important in beginning to build up mutual confidence, which, as was said earlier, is the basis of understanding, which is the basis of living properly with your neighbor. And of course, what is happening now in media is absolutely extraordinary in historical terms, the speed at which change is generated by digital techniques and digital technology. And we've seen in my own country, in both the general election 2 years ago and then in the referendum, the impact of social media and how it's created an extraordinary echo chamber, which is completely parallel to any kind of the media systems that were in place until even a few years ago. I mean, in the case of the United Kingdom referendum, the Brexit case was much more effective with its social media than the Remain case. And they very cleverly managed to get their message through to a lot of people who didn't even vote ordinarily, which is an interesting comment and perhaps is a kind of pointer in the wind to the future. But equally, in the general election, something happened which I think was really intriguing, because I was in charge of the committee in the House of Lords that was looking into media matters, and we decided we'd hold an inquiry into the general election debates on television. And it was a domestic issue, and we thought of every possible permutation of how it might pan out. And we didn't think of what happened. And these are a group of quite intelligent people with some very intelligent advisors. What happened in the British general election of 2015 was that the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party, who is a striking younger middle-aged woman, Nicola Sturgeon, and she appeared on the regional television in scarlet high heels and looking extremely sexy. And she was this kind of dominatrix figure. And all the middle-class people in England who had been tempted to vote Labour saw this figure and were persuaded that if she got in Scotland, then Labour would get in England. And the one thing they didn't want was that, even though they were very tempted. So they all turned and voted Tory. So it was a regional candidate arguing regional policies because of television was, in my view, the most significant element in that general election campaign. So the point I'm making is that we're living at a point in history, I suspect, where the means of communicating your message, the means of conducting journalism, using that word in its widest sense, which are so important in the context of human rights, is changing, and changing very rapidly. What we've got to do, because we wouldn't be here if we weren't interested in supportive of the concept, is to win the argument. And you've got to do that both logically and emotionally. And sometimes I think that the logical end of this plays perhaps too big a part, because in the politics of nationalism as we see it, which is a policy which inherently categorizes people not as people with human rights, but as groups who, for one reason or other, have privileged or less privileged positions in society, is that we've not spent enough time arguing on the emotional level. And what we've got to remember, ultimately, I think, and it's my experience in countries where they aren't free in the way we consider people to be free, is that most people, everything else being equal, actually would like to live in a society where the kind of democratic and liberal values that we all espouse are in fact in place. So, in conclusion, I think we've got to, first of all, actually believe in something. I don't mean pay lip service to it. We've got, as individuals, believe in something, and our behavior in whatever we do has got to actually endorse that. Secondly, we must be intellectually curious and tolerant. We must accept that other people are different, but being different is just that. It doesn't mean worse. And finally, we've got to recognize we've got to be rather more intellectually agile about some of these things than we have in the past. Interestingly, the last coalition government, and this government up to now in the UK, has stuck by its pledge of spending 0.7% of its GDP on aid. This has been criticised very heavily, but I think the remarks earlier made by the gentleman who's talking about Lebanon made the point absolutely perfectly. The problems we're facing in Western Europe, which are rising out of the Middle East and out of Africa, cannot be solved within Europe alone. We've got to realize that the nature of the world we're in now is that abroad is also at home, and at home is also abroad, because everything is getting closer and closer together. At the end of the day, in the old British phrase, you've got to put your money where your mouth is.
Thank you very much, Lord Inglewood, for a very thought-provoking talk, which lives up to the title in many ways. I'm sure you've provoked many questions and comments. We can take at least 2, maybe 3 if they're concise. We'll start in the front with a member of our advisory board and then come to you. We didn't get to you last time. Please.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Ögmundur Jónasson from Iceland, and thank you very much for your excellent, thought-provoking, but somewhat, from my point of view, controversial talk. And I want to focus on the controversial. Now, you refer to the collective human gene, that there is something within all of us admiring or accepting authoritarianism. And you refer to Stalin, you refer to Robespierre. I would maintain that there was something wrong in the individual gene of these people, something we should be aware of. And when you put on one side fundamentalism, on the, shall we say, the moral yardstick, fundamentalism, on the other, fundamental human rights, and you say that under certain circumstances it would be justifiable to curtail the latter, the fundamental rights, individual liberties, I understand it, in order to fight the former, the fundamentalism which you said was the worst thinkable phenomenon, and I agree with you there. But isn't this exactly what the autocrats use in order to justify their powers, that it is necessary to curtail liberty in order to fight something worse? Aren't we on a dangerous road there? Shouldn't we stick at all times with fundamental rights and the fundamental right of democracy?
The answer is I think I must have misexpressed myself to some extent, because the way you described it was not the way I had meant to express it. But I think 2 things. First of all, there does seem to be something in the human psyche which is authoritarian and fundamentalist. I don't believe everybody who has got caught up in these activities over the generations were bad. But somehow things mutate and people get corrupted. As far as the fundamental points about human rights, I agree with you. What I was saying, though, was not that I approved of that proposition. I was saying that I believe that's an explanation for why people say this now. And they don't say it just to aggravate you or me. They say it because they believe it.
Okay, I think Oktar was next.
My name is Oktar Babun. I'm from Turkey, TV channel A9. Thanks for the talk. And you said you're not sure about the future, but I'm very hopeful about that, because there's always has been, not clash of civilizations, but there's a clash between the good and bad people. And good people will definitely win at the end. So next 5 years, I think the world will change and this wars will stop, because there is always has been in the history people who have been organizing the crime. For example, if there is a war, both sides are suffering from that. Take the United States, for example. They were in Iraq and Afghanistan. $7 trillion were spent. And 50,000 ex-American soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan are homeless and became addicted to narcotics. So there's casualties from both sides, and everybody suffers from that. Now, these specific times are described in the religions also, in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And at the end, there will be a very good times. Golden age is a glad tidings. So as a politician, how do you see this future, next 5 years?
I'm very reassured you're an optimist. I'm an optimist. I don't have anything like, I'm afraid, the confidence that things will turn out right quickly that you do. I mean, to go back to your American example, as you were talking about Iraq and Afghanistan, I was also thinking of Vietnam. People are able to make the same mistake over and over again. I don't think I'd bother to go on if I wasn't an optimist. And I like to think that, and I'm an Anglican Christian, I would like to think that we will, the best in human beings will eventually out. But it is a roller coaster ride. And the 30 Years' War was just that, 30 years. And if we're at the start of a 30 Years' War, the immediate prospects for my children and many of your friends, isn't particularly encouraging.
Let's take maybe, okay, first of all, take maybe one more question, because we're over time, from the Deputy Prime Minister of Uganda, and then I would suggest we take a short break. We were supposed to have a half-hour break, but we're a half-hour behind schedule, and maybe during the break we can try to approach the Lord and ask some of the other questions, because there's many hands. But let me first give it to the Deputy Prime Minister of Uganda. And then
I just wanted to thank you for your explanation. But all along we have been wondering, personally, whether what happened in Iraq would have been avoided if John Blair and George Bush took different decisions.
I think you may be right. At the time of the second Iraq invasion, it was my view, it was legal, but it was foolish. And I was partly supported in that view by my uncle, who had been the British ambassador in Baghdad. We made I think, a very big error. It doesn't mean that it would have all been sweetness and light had it not happened. But I don't believe that by any objective analysis, you can say that the way in which the victors in the land war conducted the ensuing peace. We lost the peace. And my own member of parliament is somebody called Rory Stewart, who is quite well known, was in America. He was he was professor at the Carr Institute of Human Rights in Harvard. And he's written a very interesting book about, and there are a number of others, about how having won with the guns and the bombs, we then hadn't a clue what to do next. And that is a very important lesson. And much of it was because the victors simply wished to impose their own ideas based on their own direct experience on the communities that they found themselves responsible for. And it didn't work.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I think we do need to conclude in the name of time with the official questions, but not the unofficial questions, so that we can do during the coffee break. But let's first of all express our sincere gratitude to Lord Inglewood. Thank you so much for coming.